The year was 1860. The Louisiana air hung thick with heat and hypocrisy, a land built on wealth and suffering, where men measured worth in acres and human bodies. In the heart of the Mississippi Delta stood Delaney Plantation, 200 acres of faded promise, owned by Clement Delaney, a man clinging to the last threads of his failing legacy. They said he worked alongside his slaves, that he was different. But desperation is a quiet poison. It seeps in slowly, through debts, pride, and sleepless nights spent staring at numbers that never add up. And when it finally takes hold, even a father can become something unrecognizable. What began as financial ruin soon twisted into something unspeakable, a plan that would turn his own sons into property. This is not just a story about slavery. It's a story about how far a man will go when he starts seeing blood as currency. Beat. And before it's over, you'll see how one man's obsession didn't just destroy a family. It infected an entire generation with silence. If stories like this hit you in the gut, the ones that peel back history's polite mask, make sure you're subscribed. We dive into the shadows of the past where the real monsters didn't hide under beds. They sat at dinner tables. Hit that bell, because what's coming next is going to make you question what a man is capable of when his soul is for sale. The Mississippi Delta in 1860 shimmered under a sun that refused mercy, its light gilding the cracked wood of Delaney Plantation, a place where the air itself carried the scent of sweat, iron, and despair, and where men worked until their bodies forgot softness. Clement Delaney stood upon his veranda each morning, his boots sinking into splintered boards as he stared across the cotton fields that had once promised wealth but now whispered only of debt and slow ruin. Pride and desperation were the twin weights upon his chest. The slaves he owned, 15 men hardened by heat and hunger, watched him with cautious eyes, aware that their master's patience had grown thin as his fortune waned, that his voice now cracked like his whip, sharp and unpredictable in the still air. Among them was Tobias, a man whose back bore old scars like carved history, whose silence carried the weight of things seen and endured. He worked not for loyalty, but for survival, each day a quiet test of endurance against cruelty disguised as order. Clement's 3 sons, Nathaniel, Edward, and Samuel, had once believed their father a man of stern honor, but now they watched him unravel, each ledger entry and failed harvest drawing him deeper into something darker than poverty, something that stained even their bloodline. Nathaniel, the eldest, bore his father's jawline and temper, but none of his conviction. He lingered between obedience and revulsion, unable to decide whether to save his father or save himself from becoming him, his hands trembling each time he held the plantation's accounts. Edward, the middle son, was a man of quiet intellect and unspoken fear, often found in the stables or beside Tobias, listening more than speaking, sensing in the older slave's stillness a kind of truth forbidden yet undeniable in its humanity. Samuel, the youngest, carried a restlessness his father called weakness, but which felt to him like conscience, a flicker of something pure still surviving beneath the suffocating weight of the Delaney name and all it had come to mean in Louisiana's rotting grandeur. Clement's debts had grown monstrous. New Orleans merchants, once cordial, now sent men with ledgers instead of smiles, their talk full of foreclosure, of lost land, of names whispered in legal offices where dignity went to die beneath ink and seal. Night after night, Clement sat in his office with whiskey and candlelight, poring over law books and property codes, searching for a loophole, a salvation written between lines that no decent man should ever try to read for profit or survival. His obsession grew until it distorted him. His reflection in the window became unrecognizable, a hollow-eyed creature muttering about legacy, about reclaiming status, about turning even despair into commerce, as though humanity itself could be mortgaged and repurchased. The sons began to notice the change, not in words but in the atmosphere, in how the house itself seemed to shrink around their father's footsteps, every creak echoing like a warning from the walls that remembered better years. Clement's voice, once measured and commanding, grew strange, slurred by ambition and madness, full of talk about productivity, about efficiency, about men as numbers, each reduced to value measured not in spirit, but in yield and obedience. He called his sons into his office one evening, the lamplight trembling between them, and spoke not as a father, but as a proprietor discussing assets, telling them they must each oversee a new kind of operation that would revive the plantation's future. The plan was simple in his mind, but monstrous in effect. He would breed endurance instead of dependence, train his strongest slaves to produce sons who would serve forever under Delaney hands, an empire of men built upon chains that never broke. Nathaniel protested first, his voice unsteady but defiant, insisting that such cruelty would damn them all. But Clement silenced him with a stare colder than iron, whispering that morality was a luxury reserved for men who could afford failure. Edward looked to Samuel for courage, but the youngest's jaw trembled with a quiet fury he could not yet wield. They knew resistance would mean ruin, yet obedience would mean complicity in something that would haunt them beyond the grave. That night, the brothers gathered behind the stables, whispering beneath the indifferent stars, their words soft but desperate, wondering if blood demanded loyalty, when loyalty meant surrendering to madness disguised as tradition and power. Tobias overheard them, his face half-shadowed by moonlight, and though he said nothing, his gaze met Nathaniel's long enough for understanding to pass. An alliance unspoken, born from shared suffering and the knowledge that men could be broken only once. The following weeks turned grim. Clement reorganized the quarters, issuing orders with the precision of a general, his eyes hollow, his faith resting entirely on the belief that cruelty could buy him redemption from poverty's humiliation. The slaves labored in silence, their every movement watched, their every breath counted. The plantation that once hummed with the rhythm of survival now pulsed with dread, as though the soil itself recoiled from the man who owned it. Nathaniel began keeping a hidden journal, his handwriting trembling across the page as he chronicled his father's descent, recording not just actions, but the absence of remorse, the way Clement's smile had vanished into something mechanical and joyless. Edward found solace in work, mending tools with Tobias and exchanging few words, their shared glances revealing an unspoken brotherhood that ignored the cruel laws separating them, for suffering made equals of all men beneath the southern sun. Samuel, restless and raw, wandered the fields at night, imagining escape, imagining fire, imagining what it would take to end a curse that wore their family name like a brand burned into generations of guilt and greed. By the spring of 1861, Clement's experiment was in motion. He spoke of progress and prosperity to men who no longer believed him, his words brittle as old parchment, his dreams built upon the silence of those who feared him. The plantation became a machine grinding away humanity. Orders replaced prayers, ledgers replaced laughter, and Clement, once merely desperate, now spoke of destiny, convinced that history would forgive the methods of a man who ensured his lineage survived. Nathaniel's journal filled with dread, each page a confession written by a son witnessing his father's soul corrode, and yet he could not stop writing, because to stop was to accept, and acceptance was a slow kind of death. Edward began to plot in silence, speaking in riddles to Tobias, whose nods carried more wisdom than any sermon. They would not fight openly, not yet, but they would remember every cruelty, every command, and wait for the storm to turn. The war had begun elsewhere, but at Delaney Plantation, another war brewed, one of conscience and control, where sons weighed the cost of obedience against the unbearable burden of becoming what they despised most. Clement, blind to rebellion, believed he had conquered failure. He saw submission where only hatred simmered, mistook silence for loyalty, and mistook fear for faith, unaware that every man around him now dreamed of freedom written in fire. The summer heat returned heavier than before, pressing down upon men who no longer prayed for rain, but for reckoning. In their eyes burned the same quiet resolve that had once made Clement powerful, now turned against him in the shadows. And as the cicadas screamed in the night and thunder rolled far off toward the river, Nathaniel closed his journal and whispered to his brothers that a man could inherit land, wealth, and sin, but not silence forever. The storm broke over Louisiana with thunder that felt like cannon fire, the clouds hanging low and heavy as Clement Delaney stood by his window, whispering to himself about salvation hidden within the laws of men. He had found a passage, a fragment of legal text buried in colonial doctrine that twisted ownership into bloodline. It promised renewal for those ruthless enough to turn the living into inheritance, and he believed it was divine revelation. Clement's study filled with smoke and candlelight as he drew diagrams across parchment, mapping bodies like property, reducing generations into lines and sums, convinced that he was reshaping destiny itself through arithmetic and ownership. Nathaniel watched from the doorway, the flicker of flame revealing a father possessed. And for the first time he wondered if madness could sound like reason when spoken with enough conviction and despair. Edward lingered by the hall, hearing phrases about continuity and male labor breeding, words that chilled him because they carried both method and purpose, evidence that Clement had transformed necessity into something far colder than survival. Samuel entered quietly, bringing coffee that remained untouched. His father barely acknowledged him, his gaze locked on ink and parchment, as if salvation itself could be drawn by hand and signed into existence. Outside, Tobias directed men to reinforce the slave quarters under Clement's new orders. None understood why partitions were being rebuilt or why certain men were separated. But fear made obedience easier than curiosity. Clement began holding meetings at dusk, calling only his most trusted laborers, men who had long since forgotten the taste of freedom. He promised lighter work, better rations, and safety in exchange for loyalty to his vision. Tobias, though outwardly compliant, recognized the pattern of a tyrant dressing cruelty in benevolence, and he marked each instruction in silence, storing it like gunpowder for the moment when words would no longer suffice. The sons avoided the meetings, but whispers reached them through the walls, tales of names written beside numbers, of assignments that sounded less like work and more like breeding instructions recited from a farmer's manual. Nathaniel confronted his father late one night, demanding clarity. But Clement's response was calm and terrifying. He claimed he was building a legacy that would outlast the war, that the Delaney name would endure upon the backs of men. Edward listened from the shadows, hearing the tremor beneath Clement's composure. It was not strength but terror wearing a mask. The fear of dying forgotten turning into obsession with creating something that could not die. Samuel fled to the river after hearing his father's speech, plunging his hands into muddy water as if he could wash away the lineage carved into him, whispering prayers to a God that had grown quiet. In the following weeks, Clement's plan deepened. He cataloged every man on the plantation, measuring their strength, skill, and lineage, reducing human beings into breeding stock in ledgers bound with cracked leather and shame. He spoke to his sons not as family, but as overseers, giving each a role, Nathaniel to maintain records, Edward to calculate output, and Samuel to manage supplies, forcing them to become accomplices in his industrial sin. Nathaniel refused silently, recording falsified numbers in protest, a rebellion written in ink rather than blood, each false entry a whisper of defiance that only he would ever read. Edward complied outwardly, but began passing coded warnings to Tobias, using tools and repairs as excuses to share knowledge, building a quiet alliance between house and field that might one day overturn the master's rule. Samuel grew distant, his eyes hollow yet fierce, spending nights crafting crude weapons beneath the stables, blades made from broken tools that gleamed faintly like promises of eventual reckoning. Clement mistook their restraint for loyalty, his arrogance blinding him to the slow conspiracy of silence forming beneath his roof, the invisible network of men bound by shared loathing and the inevitability of resistance. He began speaking of expansion, of turning Delaney Plantation into a model for the South, claiming he had discovered a system that could double production and ensure the prosperity of every man who dared abandon sentiment. In New Orleans, merchants listened to his theories with polite horror disguised as admiration. They drank with him, laughed at his jokes, yet whispered behind his back that madness and genius had finally shaken hands. When Clement returned, his pockets full of promises and letters of interest, he ordered Tobias to begin construction of new quarters, larger, colder, more efficient, and the plantation took on the sound of hammers forging despair. Nathaniel watched the men labor and wondered if history would ever remember their names, if the earth itself could bear witness when justice remained blind, and silence became the only language left to speak. Edward began copying letters from his father's desk, sending them north through traders who asked no questions. He hoped that somewhere beyond this heat-choked land, truth might find an ear willing to listen. Samuel's restlessness became fury, and one night he confronted Tobias, asking when men would act, when patience would end. Tobias only replied that revolutions do not begin with shouting, they begin with shared breath and waiting. Clement's paranoia grew with success. He saw betrayal in every shadow, demanded confessions from men who had none to give, and punished hesitation as treason, blind to the quiet unification his tyranny inspired. As spring bled into summer, thunder rolled daily over the delta. Storms pounding fields that once yielded cotton, now soaked in sweat and fear, every raindrop a reminder that nature washed away all illusions of control. The sons no longer spoke at dinner, their father's laughter brittle and hollow as cracked porcelain. Each meal a ceremony of denial performed beneath portraits of ancestors whose painted eyes condemned them all. Clement toasted his vision each night, raising his glass to legacy, while the men beneath his command dreamed of fires yet to come, and the sound of thunder grew closer with every passing day. And in the final hours before dawn, as lightning forked across the sky, Nathaniel whispered to his brothers that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one rising within every man forced to serve beneath their father's name. Morning came like a bruise upon the delta, the sky heavy with dust and regret, as Clement Delaney walked through his plantation counting bodies instead of blessings, numbers echoing louder than names in his fevered mind. Nathaniel stood on the porch watching his father, noting how each step looked rehearsed, as if Clement performed normalcy for an invisible audience, an actor trapped in a role written by greed and desperation. Edward spent his mornings with Tobias repairing fences that no longer needed mending, their silence a kind of code, every nailed plank a prayer that strength might soon replace fear in the hearts of men. Samuel moved through the stables like a restless shadow, his hands raw from sharpening stolen tools into something that might one day cut through more than wood, his rage simmering behind a mask of obedience. Clement called for inspections daily, forcing his sons to accompany him, their eyes dead to the suffering they witnessed, their hearts forced into silence by the power of blood and duty turned to poison. He spoke in sermons now, pacing before his workers with the cadence of a preacher, declaring that hardship made men pure, that obedience was salvation, that the Delaney legacy would rise again through discipline. The men listened, but their faces remained blank. Their loyalty an illusion Clement mistook for faith. Beneath that stillness, defiance grew like roots twisting unseen through the cracked foundation of his empire. Nathaniel began documenting everything in his secret journal, describing each decree and punishment, believing that if he could not save the living, he could at least preserve their truth for whatever future might remain. Edward, though quieter, became the voice of reason among the men, urging patience, teaching them how to delay without disobedience, how to sabotage without suspicion, how to bleed a tyrant slowly without drawing a knife. Samuel refused patience. He dreamed of immediate justice, of flames swallowing the big house, of his father's empire collapsing into ash, and each night his dreams burned hotter until sleep itself became dangerous. Clement's obsession deepened as the war beyond his fields raged louder. He told his sons the world was falling apart, and only his order could preserve them, blind to the fact that his order was decay. He expanded the quarters again, claiming efficiency, yet the sound of hammers had turned mournful, as if every strike upon wood carried the rhythm of hearts breaking beneath forced endurance. Nathaniel watched Tobias stagger one evening under the weight of exhaustion, stepping forward to help, but stopping short, knowing kindness from a master's son would only make both men targets for Clement's wrath. Edward began reading aloud from the Bible in the evenings, choosing passages about justice disguised as sermons about faith, and though Clement praised his devotion, he never realized the words were rebellion in Scripture's clothing. Samuel avoided the readings, slipping into the woods where he met Tobias in secret, their alliance forged not in trust, but in necessity, both knowing that survival now required action rather than endurance. They planned quietly, speaking through gestures, agreeing that the time for patience was ending. Each man carried the memory of someone lost, each breath a promise that this cycle would break before another generation suffered. Clement, sensing unrest, grew crueler, his punishments theatrical, his voice louder as if volume alone could drown guilt. He believed fear immortalized obedience, not realizing it only sharpened the blade meant for him. He began locking rooms at night, counting his son's steps through the halls, convinced betrayal lurked in their whispers. Even the house seemed to recoil from his presence, the walls swollen with heat and hidden anger. Nathaniel could no longer write without trembling. His journal had become prophecy, each entry foretelling collapse, his words heavy with guilt for recording history instead of rewriting it through courage. Edward's health faltered under the weight of deceit. Sleepless nights left him hollow-eyed yet determined, his mind calculating possibilities, his heart measuring risk, until even hope felt like arithmetic balancing on the edge of ruin. Samuel's temper finally snapped one night when Clement struck Tobias for imagined defiance. He lunged forward, fists clenched, but Nathaniel restrained him, whispering that rage without timing would only build more graves. The storm outside matched the chaos within, thunder shaking the rafters as if the heavens themselves condemned what man had built upon misery. Lightning flashed through broken windows, illuminating faces too weary to pretend. Clement toasted the storm as omen of triumph, laughing at nature's fury, believing it bowed before his will. His sons exchanged glances across the table, silent understanding tightening around them like a noose of resolve. Tobias limped through the mud after midnight, staring at the main house glowing faintly through rain, whispering names of men who had fallen under Clement's rule, promising each spirit that their suffering would not be forgotten. Nathaniel found him there and spoke of timing, of signals, of dawn chosen not for glory but necessity. For even justice demanded precision when delivered against a man who believed himself immortal. Edward carried word through the fields, under pretense of repairs, his calm tone spreading resolve. No weapons would need to shout. Only one moment of unity would decide whether freedom could breathe again. Samuel prepared the tools he had hidden for months, oiling blades, steadying his hands, not out of hate alone, but from a desperate need to end a nightmare that bore his own bloodline's name. Inside the house, Clement sat in his office surrounded by ledgers, whispering to ghosts of profit, blind to the footsteps gathering outside, blind to the quiet revolution built from patience, rage, and unbearable love for the lost. The clock struck 3, Thunder rolled across the delta, and every man still awake felt history holding its breath, as if the land itself waited for justice too long, deferred to finally arrive. And when lightning split the sky open again, the sons of Delaney moved together at last, not as heirs, not as slaves, but as men ready to end the legacy that had devoured them all. The night hung heavy over Louisiana. Clouds swollen with unspent rain, the air dense with tension that clung to the skin like oil, as though the heavens themselves held their breath before judgment. Clement Delaney sat alone in his study, half drunk and muttering over ledgers that no longer balanced, unaware that his empire of fear had already begun to collapse beneath the weight of whispered defiance. Nathaniel stood in the hallway outside, his pulse steady despite the storm inside his chest. He knew the moment had come when silence could no longer be mistaken for loyalty, nor endurance for weakness. Edward crouched near the stables, distributing crude torches and iron tools to the men, his calm authority holding them together, the rhythm of his voice blending with the thunder's growl above the soaked earth. Samuel waited by the gate, soaked to the bone, his knuckles white around the hilt of a broken blade, his eyes fixed on the dark shape of the main house, the symbol of everything lost. Tobias emerged from the shadows, carrying a rope and a look that was neither hatred nor relief, only the weariness of a man who had waited too long for justice to find its hour. Inside, Clement heard movement, but mistook it for the wind. Arrogance dulled his instincts, made him believe that no man dared touch him, not while his name still carried weight in frightened hearts. Nathaniel entered the study first, drenched and trembling, speaking his father's name not as a plea, but as a verdict. Clement turned, startled, confusion flickering across his face before recognition hardened into contempt. "Legacy," Clement hissed, slamming his palm against the desk. "You will destroy everything." Nathaniel stepped closer, eyes wet with fury. "You already did," he whispered, voice steady as the storm shook the window panes. Edward appeared behind him, lantern raised high, the flame reflecting in his father's glassy stare. The old man laughed, a brittle sound like dry leaves, certain his sons would falter before spilling blood. But the sound of approaching footsteps shattered that illusion. Tobias and the men entered, silent as ghosts, surrounding the room where Clement's empire had been built on ink, fear, and his own decaying pride. The thunder outside masked every sound as Edward read aloud the final entry from Nathaniel's journal, each line a condemnation written in the language of truth that Clement had long refused to hear. Clement reached for his pistol, but Samuel's blade struck first, knocking it from his grasp, metal clattering across the floor. The old man fell back into his chair, breath shallow, his arrogance finally cracking. Nathaniel's hand shook as he approached, not with hatred but exhaustion, every memory of cruelty and loss converging in that single moment when sons became judges and a father faced the weight of his sins. Tobias stepped forward then, voice low and calm, telling Clement that men are not born wicked but choose it, and tonight those choices would meet their reckoning beneath the same roof they had haunted. Rain burst through the open windows, extinguishing the candles one by one, shadows devouring the room until only lightning lit their faces. Haunted men illuminated by justice they never asked to deliver. Clement rose, staggering toward them, defiant to the end, shouting about bloodlines and empire, about how men without power were nothing but dust, but his words drowned beneath the roar of the storm. Nathaniel's voice cut through the chaos like steel. "You built this on our backs. Tonight, it ends." The air stilled, the men watching, breath held as if time itself waited for the outcome. When it was over, Clement Delaney lay motionless beside his toppled desk, his eyes staring upward, unseeing, the rain washing across the floor as though the house itself sought to cleanse what it had witnessed. No one spoke for a long while. The only sound was thunder retreating into distance and the hiss of water upon wood, the storm's anger fading into the quiet relief of something finally undone. Nathaniel closed his father's ledger, tearing the pages from their spine, feeding them to the fire until the ink dissolved into smoke, the last remnants of Delaney's empire curling upward into the night. Edward gathered the ledgers that remained and tossed them into the river at dawn, the swollen water swallowing every record of ownership, as though the earth refused to carry the burden any longer. Samuel watched the sunrise without triumph, knowing that freedom born from violence carried its own ghosts, yet feeling the weight of generations lifting from his shoulders with every breath of clean morning air. Tobias stood beside him, the rope still in his hands, eyes on the horizon. He murmured that the land would heal only when men stopped believing they could own what the soil never gave. By midday, the men gathered in the yard, their chains piled like relics before the burned-out house. None cheered, for victory tasted too bitter, but the silence between them felt holy in its peace. Nathaniel buried his father beneath an unmarked tree. No sermon, no marker, only rain softening the earth. He whispered a single word, "Enough," and turned away, leaving the past to the mercy of the Delta. Edward began writing again, not ledgers but letters, chronicling the truth they had lived. He knew history would forget their names, but he wrote anyway because silence was the seed of tyranny. Samuel left first, heading north toward rumor and rumor of freedom, carrying nothing but a blade dulled by justice and a heart no longer owned by fear, the road stretching like promise before him. Tobias remained behind, tending the fields until the soil turned fertile again. His labor no longer servitude, but remembrance, each furrow a grave for the ghosts that once ruled from that dying house. Years later, when strangers passed the overgrown ruins of Delaney Plantation, they said the wind carried whispers of men's voices, not in mourning, but in warning, against greed, against silence, against forgetting. Nathaniel never returned, but his writings found their way into northern papers, stripped of names yet heavy with truth, a testament that even in the darkest corners, men could still rise against madness. And when storms rolled again over the Mississippi, the thunder seemed to echo the words spoken that night, that legacy built on suffering is no legacy at all, only a debt the earth will one day reclaim.